Thank you for inviting me to speak. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Paul Hackett, and I'm just a guest here at Sravasti for a few days. I was asked to speak about my experiences in terms of what has motivated me to continue in my Dharma practice and study, which has been close to 40 years now. My training is as a scholar. I'm not a Dharma teacher. I've never been ordained. Consequently, I tend to not speak extemporaneously. I tend to prepare well in advance. Thank you. I was also, so speaking off the top of my head is not really my thing. It was suggested that I could simply speak from the heart, which is even less my thing. But to try to talk about what has kept me motivated and dedicated in my studies and practice, the best thing I could do is probably just tell you a little bit about my life and what has led me to this point. And I guess I would say that, what we're really talking about is the issue of faith, or at least what's typically called faith in most religions. That is that sense of dedication to one's religious practice. And I guess I would start by saying that one of my earliest memories of the Buddhist tradition was walking down a street one summer afternoon, and a kind of gold glint caught my eye, and I turned and looked, and there was a glass doorway into a building and a gold Buddha at the end of the room, and it just completely captivated and I fixated on it. I think I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, and I didn't know why, but I just kept looking at it, and I was eventually kind of dragged off to wherever I was going. And then many years later, as I was reading various things, literature, I came across a lot of references to Buddhism. And what I read, I found very fascinating. I found very intriguing the philosophical problems it was discussing. And it led me to take up a meditation practice. And over the course of the next, 3 or 4 years, I was in high school at the time, I began meditating more and more. But it's not something that I've ever really spoken about, and partially because I grew up in an environment that was not really receptive to the Buddha Dharma or meditation. I was living with my grandparents, and I would go out every evening off into the forest and meditate. And one evening, as I was going out the door, my grandmother said, "What do you do out in those woods?" And I said, I think. And she said, "It's not healthy to think that much." and so that was kind of the kindest response that I got to my meditation practice at the time. Nonetheless, when I went off to college and was pursuing sciences and all of that, I maintained a meditation practice as much as one can living in dorms in a major university. But nonetheless, as life went on through my 20s, I kept coming back to this issue of meditation, to the experiences that I had had in meditation as a teenager and throughout those years, and wanting to learn more and more. And as I looked into the various traditions, texts that were published, there was very little at the time. I kept finding that the Tibetan tradition seemed to have answers to a lot of the questions that were occurring to me, and that it was clear that there was far more that I could not access because I couldn't read Tibetan. At the time, you couldn't just go down to the street. I think almost every major city in America nowadays you can find a Buddhist center, if not actually a Tibetan center. But 30, 35 years ago, that was not the case. And so I made the decision to go to graduate school, which was the only place you could really go and study Tibetan and eventually Sanskrit. And the problem with that, of course, is that like any profession that one goes into, it's very easy to get seduced by other motivations. So even though my original motivation was personal, at a certain point you think, oh, it would be wonderful to become a professor at a prestigious university and all the sort of, I guess, well, what passes for fame and glory that goes along with that. But I had the good fortune on landing in graduate school to meet my Tibetan teacher, who was a geshe from one of the major monasteries. And I had the good fortune to be able to live with him for almost 10 years. And over the course of my studies, both in graduate school and with him, I began to see his level of accomplishment, no, that's not the right phrase, to see the effect that it had on him and the peace of mind that he had, among many other wonderful qualities. And when I finally was able to understand how he dealt with adversity, how he dealt with, shall we say, difficult students, that his commitment to their well-being superseded any of his own needs, I was really sort of awed by that. And I realized that his abilities were so far beyond anything that I might have even had an inkling of. So this has been ongoing for me for now, as I said, close to 40 years. But I guess what I would say is that in terms of motivations, I think to these sort of three distinct elements. The idea of what's called the faith of clarity, where you see a virtuous object and it inspires you, much as that gold Buddha did when I was 8 or 9 years old. What's called the faith of not realization, I'm forgetting the word, but the fact that when you engage in meditation and it has a noticeable effect on your mind, and you see what a positive thing that is, that it reinforces the motivation in you to continue. And then finally, I would say, just from my teacher, recognizing his level of attainment, it at least manifested in his behavior, his ability to interact with others in a constructive and kind manner, things that I failed at routinely and if not every day. That sort of sense of faith that's a wish to attain that level. Those three things, I guess I would say, is what's sort of served as my motivation to keep going and to try to maintain my perspective on what my motivation should be in engaging in this material, and to, if not make any substantial progress in this lifetime, at least lay the foundation and sow the seeds for subsequent lives. Thank you.